Most homeowner painting videos hand you $40 of blue tape before you've touched a brush, like you can't be trusted with a straight line. My name is Gary Holt, and I've worked 4 trades over 40 years. Mechanic, roofer, general contractor, and painting more rooms than I can count. And that tape is rarely the real problem. This video throws it out completely and shows you the actual technique. How to load a brush, cut a corner freehand, and keep an edge wet so the whole wall looks like one continuous pass. Do the prep right, and this paint job holds up for years, not months. No painter, no tape. Just the same hallway I'm about to paint as fast as most people can tape it. That habit has a name, the tape trap, and it isn't really about protecting your walls. It's about selling you the idea that painting takes more time and more money than it actually does. So you end up hiring it out or buying gear you don't need. Every strip of that tape stuck along an edge is really just a quiet vote of no confidence in your own hands. It's worth learning to do this right instead of muscling through it. Because a good interior paint job is one of the only projects in a house that pays you back more than it costs. Resale data on interior painting puts the return around 107%. So a paint job running $3,500 can add back something like $7,245 in perceived value when the house eventually sells. Painting a room right isn't a throwaway weekend chore. It's one of the few upgrades in a house that actually makes you money instead of just spending it. Now, lasts for years needs to mean something real, not just a line in a title. A living room or bedroom painted properly, with decent paint and real prep, can hold up for 5 to 10 years before it needs another coat. A hallway like this, one takes more abuse. Hands, shoulders, kids running through with backpacks, so 2 to 4 years is closer to normal even with solid work. That's still years, not months. And it's a long way from the sloppy result you get when a room gets rushed with no prep and no sanding. Kitchens and bathrooms sit on the rougher end of that scale, needing a fresh coat every 3 to 5 years, from grease, steam, and constant cleaning. While a ceiling that never gets touched by hands can go a decade or more without meeting a thing. Where a room lands on that scale comes down to the quality of the paint and how much real prep goes into the wall, and that's exactly what nobody wants to slow down and teach you. So forget the tape sitting in your cart. What you actually need is a handful of cheap tools you probably already own half of, a wall that's prepped right, and a few techniques most homeowner videos skip, because teaching them properly takes longer than just handing you tape and calling it done. Every tool that goes into this bag is cheap, and none of it needs to cost a fortune. Start with a paint tray and a liner. The liner is the whole trick for a homeowner because at the end of the job, you just pull it out and throw it in the garbage instead of standing at a sink scrubbing dried paint out of a tray for 20 minutes. Add a roller cage, the little wire frame the sleeve slides onto, and get a pole with a handle that locks into place with a pin so it can't spin on you halfway up a wall. That pole is doing more work than people give it credit for. Once it's extended, you can keep both hands below your heart instead of reaching overhead with one arm doing all the work, cutting real strain off your shoulder over a whole room. Working it with 2 hands also spreads the load evenly and gives you a steadier coat than one tired arm ever will. For the sleeve, grab an 18mm microfiber cover, since that holds enough paint to cover more wall between reloads without turning into a dripping mess. Pair that with a 3-inch angle brush for the edges and corners, and it doesn't need to be expensive. A solid one runs about $20 and will outlast several rooms if you rinse it out properly after each use. Then there's the 5-in-1 tool, and this is the piece that gets left out of the bag more than any other, then regretted the first time cleanup rolls around. It's a scraper. It works fine as a screwdriver in a pinch, and once the job wraps up for the day, it's what scrapes the leftover paint out of your roller sleeve and back into the can. That means you're not wasting good paint or losing 20 minutes at a sink washing gear you'll need again tomorrow. Round the kit out with a utility knife, because there's no painting job on record that didn't need one eventually. A ladder, and a sanding pad or sponge. Before buying any of it new, it's worth checking what's already sitting in a garage or a junk drawer, since half of these tools show up second-hand at yard sales for a few dollars each. An old ladder or a mostly full roller frame someone else stopped using works exactly the same as a brand new one. The gear doesn't need to look good. It needs to work. Buy all of that once, and it runs somewhere around $100 to $150 total, and every room after this one gets cheaper because the gear is already sitting in your garage. The very first room you ever paint costs more than $100 once the tools are counted in. but later rooms really can land under that number in just paint and a few consumables. None of that gear does any good yet, though, because the wall itself isn't ready for a brush, and that's the step that gets skipped more than any other one in this job. Before any of that gear touches a wall, the room needs to be ready, and this is where most homeowner paint jobs fall apart before they even start. If the last person to paint this room let wall color bleed onto the trim or the ceiling line, grab some trim paint and clean that up first. Don't worry about being neat here. Get it a little sloppy if you have to, because you're going to come back and cut a sharp new line over the top of it anyway. And what matters right now is that no old color is peeking through once the new paint goes on. Once the trim and ceiling lines are cleaned up, it's time to sand. And this is the part nobody tells homeowners to do. Builder-grade paint jobs almost never get sanded between coats, which is exactly why a brand new house can look perfect from across the room and still feel like sandpaper the second you run a hand across the wall. A wall that's been sanded properly feels smooth, almost soft, while a wall that hasn't feels gritty and a little dirty even when it looks clean from a few feet back. None of this needs real money spent on it either, since a basic sanding sponge handles the job fine. It's worth asking why sanding gets left out of so many tutorials in the first place. Skipping it doesn't save the homeowner any real time, but it does mean the finished wall never looks quite right, which is a decent way to end up buying another gallon of paint and trying the whole thing over again next year. A 5-minute pass with a sanding sponge before a brush ever touches the wall is the cheapest insurance in the entire job. Cheap rollers make this worse, since a rough shedding roller lays down lint and uneven texture that no amount of light sanding fully corrects afterward. Pairing a decent brush and roller with proper sanding matters more than which specific gallon of paint ends up in the tray. Sometimes the ceiling itself needs more than a touch-up, especially if it's yellowed or picked up years of grease and smoke, and if that's the case here, it gets a clean coat of its own before the walls take priority. That's a slightly different technique, since a ceiling gets rolled in a different direction than a wall does. But the sanding rule stays exactly the same either way. Here's the part that actually separates a good paint job from a great one, and it isn't happening yet. The cleanest line in this whole project doesn't come on the first coat. It comes on the second, once there's already a layer of paint down and the brush has less resistance to fight against. Keep that in mind, because everything in the next section is about getting a solid first coat on the wall, and the real precision work is still ahead. With the wall sanded and the trim lines clean, it's time to load a brush and start cutting in without a single strip of tape anywhere in the room. Loading the brush right matters more than people think. Push the bristles into the paint until they're actually full, not just dipped at the tip, because if you underload the brush, it drags across the wall and skips instead of laying down a clean, even line. Outside corners are the easiest place to start. Set the heel of your brush, the flat part right where the bristles meet the handle, about a 1/4 inch off the corner, and draw a line down. On the way back, push that paint right up against the edge until it meets clean. There's one test that tells you if it worked. Stand at the far end of the hallway and look down the wall toward the corner. If 2 different colors are visible meeting at that edge from a normal standing distance, the line failed and needs to be redone. If it reads as one continuous color, that's a professional edge, and it took nothing but a steady hand and the heel of a brush. Baseboards and trim work the same way, just upside down. Get low enough that you can actually see under the line you're cutting, instead of guessing from standing height. Load the brush a little lighter than for the ceiling line, draw it about a 1/4 inch off the trim, and push the paint down into the gap before pulling it forward along the edge. If the brush starts picking up too much paint partway through, pull it away from the wall and reload rather than fighting through it, since forcing a heavy brush is how lines start to wobble. Wall plugs and light switches get the same treatment every single time. Cut these in by hand with the brush and never let a roller get anywhere near them. A roller-smeared outlet cover is the clearest sign in any house that somebody rushed the job, and it's completely avoidable with 30 extra seconds of brush work per outlet. Getting the heel technique right takes maybe 2 or 3 corners of practice before it clicks, and once it does, it becomes the fastest single motion in the whole job, faster than pulling a strip of tape off a wall ever was. One habit worth building alongside it is rinsing the brush the moment a cutting-in pass wraps up, not hours later once the whole job's done. Modern acrylic paint has enough binder in it that a brush left loaded for a few hours starts stiffening at the base, and a stiff brush never lays down as clean a line again, no matter how much it gets worked back into shape. Cutting in this way doesn't take as long as taping the room would have. A full room of blue tape eats up a real chunk of the day before a single stroke of paint goes down. And plenty of that tape still lets paint bleed underneath it anyway, which means touching up lines by hand ends up happening regardless of how much tape got bought. Skipping it and cutting freehand looks tougher, but it's genuinely the faster one, and once the heel of the brush technique clicks, going back to taping a room stops making any sense. Cutting in only handles the edges, so once that's done on a wall, it's time to load the roller and cover the rest of it. Take a minute to work the paint fully into the sleeve before it ever touches the wall. Roll it back and forth in the tray until it's evenly loaded all the way around, not just soaked on one side, because a properly loaded roller with decent paint won't drip, while a rushed one will. The actual rolling technique is lighter than it looks. You want to set the roller against the wall and barely press into it, letting the paint transfer off on its own instead of grinding it in. Work in sections about 2 roller widths at a time, moving top to bottom, then go back over the section just finished to even out any heavy spots and blend the roller work into the brush lines from the cut. Stay a few inches short of the ceiling and the baseboard on this pass, so there's zero risk of the roller clipping a line that's already been cut clean. There's one rule in painting that matters more than any tool in the bag, and it's called the wet edge. Always roll into paint that's still wet, never into paint that's already started to dry, because most paints on the market can start setting up on a wall in as little as 20 minutes, even though the can says something closer to 2 hours. That number on the can is written for the worst case. An old plaster wall in a cold, damp basement, not a living room with the heat or the air conditioning running. In practice, that means if the phone rings while a wall is half finished, the wall gets finished first and the callback happens after, because stopping midsection leaves a hard ridge behind that has to be sanded out later. The second rule is just as simple and just as easy to break without noticing. Once a rolling direction gets picked for a section of wall, stick with it from top to bottom and never switch part way through, especially in a narrow strip next to a window or a doorway. Changing direction on the same section shows up as a visible line in the texture once the paint dries, even if it looked fine while it was still wet. This isn't a race, and treating it like one is where paint jobs go wrong. A roller blasting across a whole wall in under 10 seconds looks fast, but it leaves uneven texture and thin spots that show up the moment light hits the wall at an angle. A slower, more deliberate pass with a normal-sized roller and a little patience produces a wall that reads as one smooth, even surface instead of a rushed weekend project. That second cut mentioned back in the prep step finally pays off here, on this coat, the one that actually delivers the professional line. Once the first coat is dry, usually within about an hour if there's decent airflow in the room, sand it one more time before the second coat goes on. Run a hand across the wall before sanding, and again right after, because feeling the difference directly tells you more than looking at it ever will, especially under regular room lighting where texture is hard to judge by eye. The precision cut happens now, on this coat, because a layer of paint is already down and there's far less drag for the brush to fight through. Load your brush lightly, wipe off the excess so the paint sits inside the bristles instead of piled on top of them, and push the tip directly into the corner or the crease where the wall meets the ceiling or the trim. A brush loaded this way lays down a genuinely straight line without snowplowing paint across the surface it's supposed to protect. There's simply less fight in the brush at this stage. The first coat had to fight bare drywall texture the whole way across, but the second coat is going over a surface that's already sealed, so the bristles glide instead of drag. And that difference alone is what makes the line come out sharp. Work one wall at a time on this coat. Cut the entire wall first, then immediately roll that same wall while the cut line is still wet, and only then move to the next wall. Blending a wet brush line into a wet roller pass is what erases brush marks completely, and it only works if you cut and roll close together instead of cutting the rest of the room first, while that line sits there drying. One more thing worth being straight about is that lasts for years doesn't mean the wall is done being fragile the moment it feels dry to the touch. Paint on a wall can be dry enough to handle light contact within a couple of hours, but the paint film underneath keeps hardening for weeks after that. It's fine to hang something light, like a small picture frame, after about 48 hours. Hold off on scrubbing or washing that wall for a few weeks while it fully cures, not just a day or two, since a full cure realistically takes something closer to 2 to 4 weeks, depending on the paint in the room. Rush that part, and a dirty fingerprint or a stray crayon mark can leave a permanent smudge right where the still, soft finish gets disturbed. That timeline shifts a little depending on what's actually on the wall. Latex paint, which is what most interior walls use today, dries to the touch fast but takes the longest to fully cure. Oil-based paint, more common on older trim and cabinetry, takes longer to dry to the touch, sometimes a full day, but it actually finishes curing sooner, often within 1 to 2 weeks instead of several. None of that needed tape or a call to a painter. The tape trap sells the idea that a homeowner can't handle a straight line, and this hallway just proved that wrong. My son Wyatt is learning it the same way, one wall at a time. Grab a brush you already own and try it on the next room, and if your walls need patching first, that's a different video coming